Again, my name is Liz Manley, and I'm really happy today to be joined by a wonderful panel of folks who are doing some interesting work across the country. For those of you who've joined us before, you're familiar with Hazelyn Pilgrim, who runs the Family Support Organization in Essex County, New Jersey, and for whom I've had a privilege of working with her for quite a long time. So Hazelyn, if you want to just say hello real quick, that'd be great.
Hello, everyone. Good to be here with you. Thank you for joining us.
And we're also joined today by Assad there from, he's from Hennepin County in Minnesota. Assad, you want to say hello?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be here, and so I could get to know all of you guys who are joining us today. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Assad. So as we get started, I wanted to talk just real briefly about when we talk about systems and community engagement, we're really talking about two things. And I'm going to do a quick overview on the first part, that systems piece and what that looks like. Gary, if you want to move that first slide real quick, that'd be great. Okay, that's who we are. And then let's get through our learning objectives. And today we're really going to be talking about the significance of engaging community partners, along with some strategies to train community partners on when and how to connect youth and families to mobile response and stabilization. And then we'll identify some strategies to engage and support culturally relevant support services as a core value of systems of care, recognizing that mobile response and stabilization is a real core value within the system of care. We want to just keep clicking this slide for just a bit. That'd be great. I like to do an overview in every one of our learning communities around what mobile response and stabilization is and what the continuum looks like, so that we get folks who are just joining us today kind of grounded in some principles. Before I even say that, I just want to say that mobile response and stabilization is what we call the customization for children crisis systems at a national level. Today, you'll hear some other terminology as Hennepin County calls it family response. It's a family response and services, but Assad will tell you more about that. It is what we're principally talking about is the same thing, and that's what's on the screen right now. What a mobile response and stabilization continuum looks like is that we're grounded in principles that young people and their families are the drivers to the request for services and supports, that they're identifying the crisis, what the crisis is and why it's important for the system to respond at that sense of urgency, that we respond within an hour, and we're really pushing nationally for a face-to-face response wherever that young person is. We recognize how huge a lift that will be, but we think it's incredibly important in meeting the needs of children, youth, and families, because children, youth, and families have unique needs that are different than the adult world. That we have a response that looks at a crisis over a 72-hour period that includes the use of a child-specific assessment tool that really focuses on the needs not only of that child, the youth or young adult, but also their families as well. And that we're really looking at stabilization services in the home, and those stabilization services would be in place up to 8 weeks. We see that shifting across the country. I have more and more states really looking to try and figure out how to be there for 8 weeks. If we can go to the next slide, that'd be great. Okay, I wanted today to talk about this idea or principle of that idea that young people heal from traumatic experience in their own homes, schools, and community. That's what the new research says, right? New research says that it supports that healing of complex trauma can take place in non-clinical settings. And that part of what we need to do really is to think about how we're going to bring young people and their families to the table with those healing principles, right? That trauma-informed living environments in which healing can take place are the precursor to formal therapy. That this is the key ingredient to therapeutic transformation. And what's important about it is we're beginning to set the stage when we talk about trauma, of really sequencing when and how interventions go into place, which is why mobile response and stabilization is so important in first meeting parents' sense of urgency, that parents understanding that something is beginning to change and that they're worried and concerned about what that might be, and how they might help their child, and then creating that safe environment in which we can bring those healing tools in as the precursor to those more formal interventions like outpatient or even outpatient or intensive outpatient, any of those type of more formal interventions. Next slide, please. So in setting that context, we also have to recognize that there are other formal systems that are really important when we talk about children and make the work in mobile response and stabilization really different, because we need to engage in these systems in ways that we can offer help and support on some of the most challenging work that these systems do. As an example, we really want to be good partners in the child welfare system, to the juvenile justice system, to the education system, to law enforcement, to healthcare, and to managed care organizations, just as some examples, right? We want our pediatricians to know when and how to help families ask for help and assistance. We want to help our child welfare partners be able to stabilize young people when they step into a foster home or a resource home. We want to be able to help our juvenile justice partners have alternatives to detention so that young people can be safe in their homes and not pose threats to the community. We want to make sure our education partners are engaging mobile response and stabilization rather than sending children that may be talking about harming themselves to emergency departments where we think that is not the best place for young people to get care. So how do we engage these systems? Next slide, please. Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to think about the challenges, right? The challenges in all of those systems is every single one of them speaks a different language, right? Education speaks the language of students and pupils. The child welfare speaks the language of cases. We have juvenile justice that speaks a whole different language. Pediatricians who speak the language of patients, just even what we call individuals. So what we do in the world of mobile response and stabilization is take the language and shift it, right, to the world in which we can communicate with everybody in the same way, right? So if we talk about children, youth, and families, actually that's a language that every single one of those systems understands. They all understand what a child is. They all understand what a family is, even if they might need a little assistance in understanding uniquenesses in family situations, right? So we want to shift our language in a way that makes sense for all of our partners to be able to see how we can be helpful. We want to recognize the mandates of a child welfare system that requires certain things to happen in order for their work around protection and permanency. We want to recognize the cultural differences within each of those silos and figure out how we can actually bridge to those silos, bridge to the culture so that we can actually be helpful to families and begin to speak to each other in a way that brings folks together to help solve the challenges of why a young person may be experiencing some of these challenges. We want to understand the rules and regulations that folks have to work with, and we certainly want to understand the financing and the financing structures. Next slide. And as we talk about mobile response and stabilization and those silos, right, and those systems, we want to make sure that our partners in those systems know how and when to use mobile response and stabilization. And I'm going to give you 3 examples how to engage each one of these systems. The first one is child welfare. As an example, the child welfare system and policy in New Jersey allows, and not only allows, but supports the child welfare system when a young person is removed from their home because of concerns of abuse and neglect by allowing and supporting mobile response and stabilization to work with that young person at the time that they touch in a resource or foster home. This is a really important concept from the perspective of recognizing that behaviors are escalating, right? That there are things that are happening underneath the water that we need to pay attention to for young folks. And so the idea that we're going to shift the silo, shift the system to have the child welfare system and our mobile response team be able to communicate proactively, to be able to support young people at the time that there is in the most crisis that a young person might experience, that this big traumatic or event or potentially traumatic event happens. And at the same time, recognize that we can support families as young people return from those foster homes back into their own homes is really powerful. Another example is how we can support schools in bridging from what happens from that young person's experience at school to home, right? You have a young person who's experiencing some suicidal ideation. What school may want to do is to have that young person go to an emergency department. What we want mobile response and stabilization teams is to say, we can help that family keep this young person safe in their own homes, and we can connect the dots between what happens for that young person between home and school. And the third really major partner that we want to talk in this work, actually, I think there are two more. One is certainly pediatricians, where we want to make sure that they know how to access the service and support families who are showing up and talking to their pediatricians about their concerns. And law enforcement, we want to make sure law enforcement knows how to connect to the system in a way that can be helpful without a co-responder model. So that's just some examples. And as we think about those examples of how we're going to engage these more formal systems, we really want to think through what is necessary in order to get there. In order to do that, we also need to understand what the goals of mobile response and stabilization are, and that is really to support that youth in their own current home. So we want to be talking about homeschools and communities with all of our partners in a way that's meaningful and that can get to that place. We want to actually talk about engagement, engaging young people and their families, but we also want to engage our systems partners in conversations about how we can be helpful. We want to be able to talk about trauma-informed care, talk about the tools that mobile response and stabilization bring to the table. We want to promote and support safe behavior in the home, schools, and communities. We want to work as a team to keep young people safe, including young people and their families in that conversation. We want to reduce the use of emergency departments, hospital boarding, and detention centers due to behavioral health crises. And we want to assist youth and families in accessing and linking to ongoing supports, which is really the focus of today's conversation about how we can help, how we can support the work in communities so that communities can help young people heal. Next slide, please. In community engagement strategies, I usually put the slide in here so that we always remember that this is really important work. But today we have two folks who are going to talk about this in more detail, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Next slide, please. And I'm going to set the stage for Hazelyn to share more about her wonderful work on the ground in New Jersey by talking about this idea of what ResourceNet is. New Jersey has a system in which they have multiple, every care management organization has basically a database of all community resources that are available to all families across the state of New Jersey that include both formal and informal supports. It's a mechanism for sharing with families in the upstream before they ever touch on the system. It's a tool that's available for all partners, including all of the partners when we talk about child welfare, juvenile justice, our law enforcement partners, our pediatricians, our managed care organizations, all can use the ResourceNet, and they all connect to each other. So you can see available resources across the full state. The care management organizations also do work in making sure that there are always formal and informal resources that are available for folks, including low cost or no cost recreational activities for families. So I just wanted to set the stage because I think it's really important work, and we'll work to get you a link in the chat box so that you can see what we're talking about. But Hazelyn, it's enough for me to talk about it. I'd prefer that you talk about it, so I'm going to hand it over to you. You're on mute.
I constantly forget to unmute myself. Apologies. So one of the beautiful things about ResourceNet is that it really does provide a place for anyone in the community, whether it's a pediatrician, an educator, a grandma down the block that is noticing something and is concerned, and they can go there and find accurate, up-to-date information about a wide variety of programs and services and informal supports. Things like, what's happening in your block this weekend, because we can all post there and connect around the common goal of keeping kids and families safe in their homes, at school, and in the community. I wanted to just share a little bit about our experience with ResourceNet. We just talked about it on Monday in one of our meetings, and we have a saying around here, you don't have to do this alone. Well, ResourceNet is a perfect example of that. We no longer have to scurry and find a resource when a family says, I need this. We can refer them to ResourceNet, and the information that they need is readily available. And if they need to come back to us, we can certainly support them in navigating it. But these are vetted resources and opportunities that are updated quarterly. So should we go back? So my focus today is really on family involvement and planning for sustainability, because I think the concept of really relying on natural supports and resources is a key part of sustainability, of the sustainability conversation. Several studies that I've read have shed light on the importance of family involvement throughout a person's experience with systems of care. And the one thing that is constant is that it improves outcomes. We've seen it in healthcare, we've seen it in education, we've seen it in juvenile justice, across all the different silos that Liz spoke about earlier. And one of the core things is recognizing the values that drive our system of care. Next. The idea that families are equal partners in all aspects of the system, including identifying needs, program development, service delivery, policy, and evaluation. There has definitely been a shift, I think, over the last several years in recognizing just how valuable that input is. We are moving from simply reaching out to families and engaging them and giving them information to actually having them co-create and co-design and lead the various initiatives in our community. And I'll share more about that later. One of the benefits that we've learned is that there's strength in our diversity, and that the fact that we have such a rich and diverse community here in Essex County, both racially, ethnically, socioeconomically, coming from all different parts of the world, that's been a real strength for us. And in terms of how we are now able to understand the cultures, the languages, the needs, and the different experiences and strengths that families come to us with. And we're looking now to see how we can do even more in terms of leveraging their involvement through vehicles like our Children's Interagency Coordinating Council, which is responsible for planning, evaluating, and monitoring services on a local level. I'll say a little bit more about the kayak in a few, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the values that really drive our work. One is that families are equal partners. There's no, we're here with families, we're not here. And that we are moving very swiftly towards shared leadership and shared responsibility for outcomes. Because without the family's involvement in outcomes, things just will not work. Okay, next. As we've made this, as we are, I shouldn't say made, as we are making, continue to grow in this direction of truly having authentic family involvement, where, as one of our board members says, families have a seat at the big table at Thanksgiving. They're not at the little table anymore. We know that it's important to support family participation in different ways, regardless of where families fall in the socioeconomic strata. When you're raising a child who has complex needs, there certainly are a lot of barriers to active participation, time being one of them. Support for the family as they are engaged in system building activities. How does childcare get handled? How does dinner get on the table? How does transportation happen? If they happen to be in a place where transportation is not readily available, or they don't have their own transportation. So we look at how can we support families in those areas by providing either transportation or a stipend, We've used Uber gift cards to help people get to and from meetings. We provide mileage reimbursement. So it's important to think about, as we talk about involving families, how do we actually make that happen? Those are some of the tools that we found and ways that we found to really enhance their ability to participate. Okay. Meeting at a time and location that is preferable and convenient for families. That has always been a challenge when we talk about bringing families and professionals together. So we have evening meetings. Oftentimes, that's not the best time for professionals, but increasingly we're seeing where people may be able to flex their schedules to come together. So we have one community. And a vehicle that we found helpful in that regard is to not so much make it a formal meeting of the kayak or the Regional Family Support Planning Council, but a conversation. So we've moved now toward having what we call community conversations or community cafes. And sometimes we do it on a Saturday morning. And we get a mixture of people who are parents. And what's nice about it is we promote it by saying, check your professional hat at the door. Come as a mom or dad, and let's have a conversation about what's going on in our community, how it's impacting us, and what we can do to bring about change. And that seems to be going pretty well. We have to also think about strategies around communication. When we first started here in Essex in 2004, I came in 2005, we would send information out. We have a group, we have a workshop, whosoever will, they can come. And there was really no mechanism for folks to contact us and share information about what they thought, what they needed, that they even planned to attend, because it was all communication in one direction. So we began to look at how do we utilize some of the emerging tools at that time, back in 2004, like customer relationship management tools like Eventbrite and Constant Contact, to reach out to families and give them an opportunity to share it with their networks, therefore expanding their network of supports and expanding the number of people that we could reach. We in fact adopted the saying, each one, reach one, teach one, because we wanted to have families know that they didn't have to come by themselves. They could invite whoever they wanted to participate in these activities and grow along with them. So that's one of the things that we learned along the way that was very helpful. We also found that during the time of COVID, it turned out to really be one of the benefits, if there is such a thing, of the pandemic. We learned that folks found it much more accessible to participate in evening meetings via technology. And so we provided workshops and information on tutorials on how to use the technology to connect. And this was beneficial not only for us as a family organization, but schools were beginning to use the platform. So it gave families more of an opportunity to engage in schools. We began to work with schools around meeting with their families and some of the tools that they needed to succeed in partnering with the school districts. So, technology has been a really big part of how we have expanded our ability to communicate. Community partnerships have expanded as a result of things like ResourceNet and the other tools that I mentioned. And we now find that it is not uncommon for us to have a number of providers on the various workshops that we provide, seminars, and we're learning together as a community, not parents and providers separately, but we're learning together as a community. And I believe that has great potential for improving outcomes. Another point about family engagement or family involvement is that families don't want to stay at the same level. We all come in at different levels of knowledge, skill, awareness, gifts, and we need to provide opportunities for them to grow. And New Jersey's had the benefit for many years of having Rutgers University Behavioral Health, which offers a myriad of courses that families can take, as well as other programs, like through other agencies, like the ARC of New Jersey, the Mental Health Association of New Jersey. And we partner with all of these entities in the community to educate and inform and encourage and engage the families so that they can continue to grow. We have families that now, look back and say, listen, I took the NAMI course on this, or I took this particular course. And this week, for example, we'll have facilitation training where parents and family partners will be trained in how to run peer support groups. So we need to continually be providing opportunities for growth. And on that point, I'd also like to mention that we have begun training families in systemic advocacy. We use our technology to do alerts about emerging issues. And we saw success a few years, well, it's been about a year and a half now, when school-based centers were facing the potential loss of funding. Families mobilized. They used social media. They were provided with toolkits from the family-run organizations and others, and advocated for change, and they succeeded, along with our community partners. They succeeded, and the funding was restored. So we're providing training and tools around not just individual advocacy, but systemic advocacy. And that's another form of growth. Acknowledgement. We do our best to acknowledge the contributions that families make by providing them with compensation for their time. They are experts in the journey of raising a child with emotional, behavioral, mental health, intellectual, or developmental disabilities. Their time has value, and we recognize that. We do not give incentives, but we do recognize people for their contributions. And oftentimes we'll hear a parent say, I don't want that. I do this because this is my way of giving back. And that's their choice. But we think it's important to include that in a strategy for involving families and making it known that we do value them. Okay, next one. This is an interesting slide that I recently shared with our board of trustees, because we've been talking about community involvement, community engagement. What does that look like? Now, this is not my work, and it may be familiar to some of you. It is the work of a group of professionals, and I have the citation. I'll try to put it in the chat for you. But
citations in the references.
Okay, great, thank you. I think that as I was pondering this with some of our board leadership, in our 17-year journey, we've kind of maybe moved from outreach to involvement, but and maybe on the cusp of collaboration, but that's our growing edge opportunity right there, where families are really beginning to collaborate in the design. Communication flow is bi-directional. It's not from the providers to the family saying, hey, come to this. We're having a family forum once a quarter, come. We don't know what the families don't know what the agenda is going to be necessarily. So maybe they can't really see, is this something I want to invest my time in? But as we shift toward more of a collaborative model where families are shaping the agenda and running the meetings, I think, there's great opportunity. And I hearken back to the comment about the cafe model, community conversations, where they are actually running the meeting and shaping the agenda. I'd like to share that 80% of our board is made up of families with lived experience. So we are truly at that level being driven by what they see and hear. Some of them have children who've recently graduated from the children's system of care and are young adults now. And some of them have children who have matured and now are entering the profession. So it's a good mix of people, and they continue to have their ear to the ground and serve as ambassadors in the community. They serve locally. One of our ambassadors is very much involved in the fatherhood initiatives around the country. And he started here in Essex County as a grandparent who was raising a child with some significant needs. And so their work on the ground continues to inform and drive what we do as an organization. And they lead these community conversations together, which is beautiful. We get to step back, check our leadership hat at our role, our titles at the door, and just be families working together. Okay. What else did I want to share? So, a couple of key thoughts. Meet families where they are. We don't come as just one group, undifferentiated. We are each unique in our needs, our strengths, our skill sets, our goals, and our experiences. Oftentimes, I still find that it's easy for us to fall into looking at what the family needs, and the shift from that needs-driven sort of deficit model, maybe, to being strength-based and recognizing just how much power families have is happening, and it's beautiful and it's important. And we need to continue to do that and to encourage that at every possible vector. Providing safe spaces. Many times in the past, we would say, let the family come to us, to our office. We'd have our support groups in the office. We had a lovely kids' room, and we thought, this is great. Now we're finding that families have their own natural gathering places. So we've done some things at the Y, at the alternative high school, in local churches, where people and families naturally gather. They don't come into an office building that's for mental health services as a natural occurrence. So we're recognizing that that's a shift that we've had to make in our organization, and to provide a safe space where they can really feel free to open up and share and give insights and valuable input, because they do have tremendously powerful insights and valid information from their own experiences and from the community that they're a part of, that can enhance our systems and the way we work. Identifying and engaging natural community and family leaders. The grandma down the street that I mentioned, who watches people's kids so that they can go to work when nobody else will watch them, or she knows about, the food pantries and the different resources, or the suburban mom who may know about the Friday group that meets in her community that's run by another parent who also happens to be a professional. That's where it is. Finding and engaging those natural community linkages and family leaders as allies in co-designing, evaluating, establishing policies, and creating programs. Okay. Next, lessons learned. We've got to have two-way vehicles for communication. Not just us talking to families, but families talking to us in real time. We don't need to just wait till the annual survey to see how we're doing. We can do it more often. We can have websites that are interactive. We can use social media as ways of fostering communication. Continually working to reduce stigma. That's a real need and ongoing lesson to be learned, because we find that in our community, stigma is very real and an ever-present stressor. And access to care looks very different in different communities. So continually working together to break down stigma by going into the schools. Our system partners, we go to schools together, we go into the community at events together, working to reduce stigma. And the last thing is maintaining a growth mindset. None of us have all the answers. I certainly don't. My team doesn't. We learn continually. And as we learn, we want to adapt to change so that this is not a stagnant system, but a vital one that is constantly evolving and changing in ways that truly provide authentic opportunities for family engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. I have a quick question for you, and then we're going to give the floor to Assad. When you talked about resource, and I just want to, let you folks know that in the chat should be the right link, but if not, I'll get it for you. How do you get the information out about ResourceNet to communities, right? Because that's something that happens at multiple levels in multiple places, right?
Right. So we have on our website, there's a direct link to ResourceNet. On our social media, ResourceNet is listed. And when family partners are engaging with families one-on-one or one-on-group, and they're asked, well, what about a resource for this or a resource for that? We direct them to ResourceNet because the information is updated and it's valid. So that's how we do it. And
that's the mobile response teams and the mobile response folks. It's the care managers and the CMOs.
Everybody has their activities listed.
Right.
If you go there today, you'll see some things that are coming up in different places. Our updates may not be as current, but certainly because we're down one person, but it's pretty up to date.
Yeah.
Forecast events that are coming up, like the transition conference for youth and young adults. So.
Yeah, I would like folks to know that that's a statewide push, like all folks to be able to be part of. Certainly the family support organizations do a huge amount of work about that. Thank you, Hazel.
You're welcome.
All right, Assad, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Assad Dahir. I'm joining you this afternoon from Hennepin County, Minnesota, and the weather is beautiful, 71 degrees, right? October 5 in Minnesota, you're asking? Yes, it is. But don't show up on Friday. It's going to go down to 40. And people here love to talk about weather, so I kind of adapted, you can say, to my locality. The next slide, I am the Children's Mental Health Program Manager here at the county. And today I want to tell you a little more of a service that we piloted in August of 2021. This is, in other states, it might be referred to as Mobile Response and Stabilization Services, MRSS, but we wanted to put our own unique flavor and said Family Response and Stabilization Services. If I had to come up with a slogan for Family Response and Stabilization, it's we put family first. My second one would have been, when you're here, you're family, right? But I heard Olive Garden that took one away before, a long time ago. So, and that's why we wanted this service to family first, to reflect on the uniqueness of this service. So I'm not here to discuss of what is the mobile response and stabilization. My goal here is to reflect more on what is the community's understanding and what are some of the challenges and opportunities that we had to engage in order to make this a successful pilot project. So if you could go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the fundamental tenet of FRSS was a family and youth-centered support services that are community-based. As the service is one service that has two components, the response within an hour, and then having the stabilization services that are up to 8 weeks. So we're staying true to the model, but had a little bit of our flavor. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Minnesota. When you think of Minnesota, what comes in your head? Oftentimes people would say snow. Some people would say some type of an accent, not mine, but some other accent. And what I like to say is Minnesota is a wonderful place to be. It's a wonderful state to be. But as often as cases are, you have to go beneath the surface sometimes to see what are some of those challenging opportunities so that you can work to make it a better place for all of us, right? So if you could go to the next slide. What we know and saw way before COVID-19 to an increased degree during COVID-19 is there is a lot of unmet needs in our community. Oftentimes that might manifest itself, especially in children with a behavior. So if I love this quote, and this kind of gives us a more comprehensive look of what is the heart of FRSS. Beneath every behavior, there's a feeling. And beneath each feeling, there's a need. And when we meet that need rather than focus on the behavior, we begin to deal with the cause and not the symptom. As oftentimes we see in a medical, using medical lenses, we focus more on what's observable. What's the behavior that's the person exhibiting, rather than what is the true cause of that behavior and how can we get in and intervene and provide more early intervention. So the heart of FRSS is families and meeting their needs. If I could go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, Minnesota is as a whole, people say is not as diverse as some other states like New York, but we're not Maine, right? But there is a diversity in Hennepin County. If you look at Hennepin County, is the most populous county in the state of Minnesota. That's where Minneapolis is in. And when you look at the demographics, you see 68% is white, 13% African American, Pacific Islander or Asian, 7% Native American, 0.5 Hispanic, 7%. And you see there is diversity. This is a true representation of America. There are vibrant communities. I know Minnesota is known as a welcoming state, has welcomed refugees in the past from Vietnam, Laos, the Hmong community. They have also been welcoming to my own community that I represent, the Somali community. The largest Somali population in Minnesota, in the US, lives in Minnesota. So there is a diversity. But when you look beneath the surface of that diversity, you see disparity. Minnesota is known as the land of 10,000 lakes. I've been told it's also the land of 100,000 disparities. So when you look now beneath and you take this veil and you look beneath the surface, what are you going to see? As you guys might have been well aware, in the last 4 years, Hennepin County, especially Minneapolis, has been in the news for police killings that happen in this state. If you could go to the next picture, please. These are some of the high-profile killings that the state and the trauma that the county, the state, and sometimes nationwide experienced. Philando Castile, George Floyd, Dante Wright, Amir Locke, all of them. And the community identified this is the system that has caused me these difficulties. This is an extension of a system issue that is targeting Black and Brown individuals and that have caused their death. So there is mistrust. So when you look at the diversity, you have to see there is mistrust and distrust of those communities towards the greater system that exists. And if you go to the next slide, you would see there is something called as the Minnesota paradox. Minnesota is a state as a whole, has the second biggest income inequality gap between Blacks and whites in the entire nation, only second to the District of Columbia, right? Which is not currently a state. Also, when you dig deeper, you see Minnesota is also one of the worst states in the country for the education achievement gaps. 8th grade math and ELA scores, 48th in the nation. When you look at Black home ownership, 46. And a lot of times communities that are impacted by these disparities attribute to a systemic structural racism that have put and empowered that people to put or marginalize others. So towards a system, there is that distrust of what you have and what you bring only causes more harm to me and my own community. So the paradox is Minnesota is a really wonderful state to live in if you come from one demographic, and not so great if you represent the minority groups, especially the African American population. So with this now comes the COVID-19. We know and understand there was disproportionality of death, more so in the BIPOC communities. But this was a time also when we saw a greater need to build those and repair those relationships with communities that mistrusted or didn't have a good relationship with the system, or the system did not have a good relationship with them. If we could go to the next slide, please. So facing with these enormities, community upheaval, in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic, where we know there was not just one pandemic, there were two pandemics that were happening. One was visible, one was invisible. And Hennepin County Board declared racism as a public health crisis. In this midst, what we were trying to do is implement FRSS, Family Response and Stabilization Services. As Hazelin alluded to earlier, this was an auspicious start for us because of what was happening kind of caused a shock. There was a pandemic scale system shock where communities that were left out from the decision table were all of a sudden being told, you do matter, your voice matters, because if one community was not responding to the system, the public health COVID-19 response, you no longer were insulated from each other. It kind of showed the true America where you live in one area, but what happens in the other area has an impact on your life and well-being too. So we're all in this together. When that went out, communities were thinking, what does that mean? Are you discovering that now, or were we not all in it together before the pandemic? And this exposes the system dichotomy of sometimes we really at a system level have good intentions, but if the community and those we are to serve don't really see us as having the same intention or the same goal, then you have this disconnect of intention with the perception. Because there is a duality of a role. You can be the sinner and at the same time be the savior. And that's where oftentimes as we go and connect with communities, the community will say, the police were an extension of the system. The inequalities that happen, all these disparities are because of a system allowed this to happen. So you can't just come in now and dissolve yourself of these things that you perpetuated, and now you're the savior. But what happened at this time, auspicious time, was the county went out and reached out to communities that they necessarily were not interested before to say, you do matter, and we want to get you a table. We want to get you a seat at the table. Let's have a messenger, because it was no longer just the message. The message has to align with the messenger. And this really did reflect on bringing trusted messengers, groups, leaderships that represented their own communities were invited to listen, give opinion, share their ideas of how they could bring this information. Whether it was testing, whether it was vaccine, whether it was just well-being, how do we take that? Because the community listens to their messengers rather than the message. And at this time, it was a good opportunity for us to leverage that relationship to say, if there is a trusted messenger group right now that is meant for COVID response, how can we tap and build on those connections? How do we make sure that we're able to reach beyond the COVID-19? Because there is the second invisible pandemic happening with children's mental health. So this is what led us to go into the community so that we cannot just share information and inform, but so that we can learn and listen and consult and involve the community. And one way we did that is Can you go to the next slide, please? Is a community engagement goals and strategies. We went and said, I had a parent and youth vision and sessions. We invited different community groups to come. And at this time, through the trusted messengers, we did see a lot of response that we didn't see prior to COVID-19. We had countywide surveys. We had community health affairs and events that we went out, didn't have to have an agenda. We were willing to engage one-on-one dialogue. We're there as guests and not hosts, because we did understand that the county cannot put out a word to say, now I want everybody to come in and meet with me here in this office, but we needed to be in those spaces where the conversations were already happening. And then parent groups, culturally specific providers who were identifying that they are having difficulty with increasing their capacity to support the demographics, their own communities, system partners. All of those things are areas we looked into so that we can build a collective outreach centered on what is family response and stabilization services. If you could go to the next slide. And what did we hear back from families, from parents? Parents said, we're struggling with resources and support, especially with immediate support, because as we saw this often in the news, kids and families flee into the ER, and medical professionals utilizing the medical lens are telling families, there is really nothing I could do for you. You might just take your child home. So families are saying, if there is something going on in my home and I'm unable to manage, who do I turn to? We need awareness and education of what's mental health, because mental health is different in different communities, it's different in different languages, it's different in different religious communities and cultural background. And what we often heard from those community of parents is, we want programs and services that uplift youth and their identities, what their needs are, and not just focus on the mental health itself, focus on what are other factors that lead to this disproportion. School being a great intersection of mental health and community service. So those are the conversations we were getting from parents to say, don't build something and then tell me about, take my voice and embed into your building blocks of what it means this to be an inclusive service. The next slide. And we did hear from youth. Youth share that they want access to resources, and the resources are different for their own unique ways. Sometimes kids are asking for digital access to resources and not necessarily a flyer that we had traditionally passed. They want to have awareness and education of what is bullying and how does that contribute? What is the community trauma? Witnessing somebody who looks like you murdered on national TV, what does that do for not just the kids that watched, but those kids when they grow up and have their own kids? What does this look like in a community that is fearful of those who are supposed to protect them? So uplifting youth, and also those mental health factors, school being a great area that was identified with as a need. The next slide. So when we looked at those data points and put together, we saw 90% of families cited a lack of community resources. And they attributed this to, it's not because I don't have the need, it's because I'm being told you're not eligible for. There is a line or a threshold you have to cross for you to even be qualified for this service. And oftentimes our children with a behavior, children that have that are families that are saying, I have a gut feeling something is happening with my child, but I'm being told to wait. And then when I wait and I end up going to the ER and asking them that I'm unable to manage the behavior, I'm being told you have to take this number and call this number, and then you have to be on a 6-week wait list. And then after that, we would give you a call for therapy. 86% of families shared a need for service navigation. Don't just give me a flyer. Walk me through the process. Connect me so that I'm able to actually receive the service and not have a flyer. It's easy to do so, but difficult to walk. So walk the walk and not just talk the talk. 65% of them identified a need for culturally specific providers. Some families, especially from my background, Somali, are afraid what it means to have a diagnosis. So they are asking for sequencing the steps. Before you go into the deep end of the pool, I want somebody to talk to me about what it feels like to go into the pool, what's like to walk into the shallow end of the pool. So families are saying, it's not because I don't want what's best for my child, it's because I'm afraid what this means and where this is leading me to. So as a system level, the response was building that relationship with trusted messengers. We were able to put a request for proposal, support up to 26 culturally specific providers to increase awareness and capacity. Culturally specific providers are providers that are, for example, if it's an African American, the population they serve is African American, their staff have to reflect on the population they serve, and the management level have to, so all those three layers have to align together. We also are looking for culturally specific stabilization providers. So FRSS, the stabilization providers, we contracted with an African American agency and a Latino agency and East African and Somali or population agency. And the other one we're looking for, and we are trying to pivot from, and Hazelin already said something about this, is the parent engagement. What often we see as a system, we see something that happens in the community, and we say, let's just get so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and put them together and say, now that's the parent group that informs us. By doing so, we're taking those key pillars from different communities and bringing them to us so that we feel good about what we're doing. Rather, what makes more sense to us now is how do we go out to those communities, and rather than dismantle what's happening, how can we support those organizations? How can we support them? How can we make them flourish? How can we have multiple parent groups that inform us and move from us being the host to us being the guest? And this has, if I have time for a 2-minute, next slide, please. And this does perfectly align with my own personal experience. As a refugee who came here when I was 14 years old, the first time I went to school in the US, I was supposed to be in 8th grade, but I only had a 2nd grade education. I remember being in Atlanta, Georgia, and I had a locker. I had a combination number. I've never used a locker before. I remember standing in the hallway and kids would come out, put the things in, and I'm struggling to open this. And then I look around, everybody's gone. And I remember an adult coming and he's like, hey, you, come. I thought he was calling me so that he can help me, right? I walked to the office. I had a suspension after school. I had to, and I didn't understand why I was getting penalized. And then I remember a few weeks later, I was in the cafeteria, and as we waited for food and lined up, I looked over to my left side, and I remember seeing something outside the window. My interest was really piqued. I went closer to the window. I kept looking at my classmates, everybody who was in the cafeteria, and nobody was really concerned what was happening outside. But my inquisitive mind would not let me just ignore. So I went to closest door. I pushed it open. I went out to the grass. I started touching what was on the grass, and it was my first snow. Now I live in Minnesota, right? So go figure. It was snow. And I remember touching, and somebody, an adult voice, was screaming, and because I opened the emergency door. To me, that was an emergency for me, right? I have never seen snow. And so sometimes we do things not because we're trying to be difficult, but because there is something, a need at that moment, and I would have benefited from having a culturally specific provider at the time to just tell me what I was feeling was normal and a better way to address. So as we learn what we are seeing now from family response being a pilot program, we're seeing positive outcomes in community resource connection 100%. 30 days after families came in to family response, 30 days later, we were able to connect with 90% of families to get a survey. 89% did not go back to the ER again. 89% did not call law enforcement. We're expanding capacity to support schools, 911 embedded social workers, and building a network of community connections. And because of a change of a strategy, and hopefully a auspicious time allowed us to be able to tap into resources that were available and a channel that was built for something completely different. And the goal is now, how do we maintain and increase that connection? Thank you.
Thank you, Assad. And let me just say, I too had a real challenge with the locker when I was in school. And unlike you, I was not a refugee and went through the whole school. Older siblings, and so every teacher knew my name to begin with, so it was quite embarrassing, and it was something that got reported to. So although I didn't get suspended for it, it's a challenge, right? And this issue of young people on that first day of school not being able to have to use a locker is not an insignificant thing, right? It's really important. But I love your story. In particular about how important it is for us to understand some of the drivers of what happens for young people, right? It's a really important story. But you also talked about some really important concepts that I want to make sure that we highlight. And I just want to say to folks who are listening, if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat. We're happy to answer them. And I'm going to get back to at least one or two of the things that were in the chat earlier. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was this, your data on the family response system, because really that's only been up and running for how long?
About a year.
About a year, right? And so just remind folks, how many young people return to the emergency department?
So what the data we collected both at the response phase, the response is 1 hour to 72 hours. 100% did not go back. As we were working with families, did not go back to the ER. And when we started FRSS, this is a community-based services. We had to shift and start at the hospital because that's where we saw the greatest need at that moment. Families and kids that were going to the ER, and the professionals were telling the families, we're giving them no choice. Take that child home, or we're going to report you to child protection for child abandonment. They were not abandoning their kids.
Right.
They were bringing them to a place where they felt they would get the support. So for some reason, a child who is sitting in the ER for 7 hours, that itself can de-escalate the situation. And now the professional sees and is like, no, he's doing well, take him home.
Yeah.
So 100% of those families did not call law enforcement or go back to the ER. And 90% of those families we were able to connect 30 days later. 89% of them did not go back to the ER.
Right, and this is in a world, so let's make sure that folks understand the world of Minnesota, in particular in Hennepin County. Prior to, and I was on the ground in Hennepin in February of 2020, so I can attest to what Assad is talking about pre-COVID, what some of the conditions were and some of the challenges were on the ground, in particular around trust and around families being distrustful of all systems, right? Of the educational system, certainly of the child welfare system, of the juvenile justice system. So there was a lot of worry, and a lot of young people were pushed either into emergency departments or into juvenile justice detention centers, right? And so but this conversation about how do you bring mobile, families were engaged when I talked about mobile response and stabilization, and we're interested because one, there was this individualized planning piece, right? We weren't saying, oh, this is a solution for everybody, like you all have to do this, right? We were saying we need to come and learn and figure out how to connect and work, right? That's the work of mobile response and stabilization. And that the hospital systems were really inundated and overwhelmed right? Pre-COVID. So what happened afterwards was just amazing. So the work of family response, of just the thoughtfulness in Hennepin of not just working on getting the service, the actual service delivered, but the thoughtfulness around the community engagement strategies. How do we bring trusted people into the community to say, we want you to try this, and we want to do this because we think it will answer what you've been telling us you're worried about, right?
Yeah, and we were able to implement a county-wide protocol that went out to all the hospitals that have ER to say, if the first step, if a family comes in and what the criteria you use do not meet the criteria for admission, the first step has to be FRSS.
Yeah.
Because what we were seeing is families, if they're given an option of somebody able to, even if this is as a reactive step to get them home, not a proactive step preventing them from coming, they were willing to try and schedule somebody to meet them later on. And those families were not going back to the ER as they learn to manage this, the child's behavior. So the hospitals are seeing a lot more value, and we have seen a tremendous increase in referrals that were coming from the hospital. We made that initial engagement with them, but as we were trying to move that and shift and put this in the community as a proactive step, we're still seeing overutilization in the hospitals because families who don't know of the service are going there for the first time to get in, but the hospitals are finding also this as a relief mechanism because they're overwhelmed.
Yeah, so two things I want to just highlight. One is that Hennepin is still struggling with this idea of how you've trained families, right? All of this time, right? That the care pathway, the way to get help is to take your child to the emergency department, right? And so you have to gather all of this strength, right? To say, okay, I'm at my wit's end. Now I'm going to go to the emergency department. So you're really determined, right, by the time you get there, right, that you're going to get your child the help that they need, right, that's what's going to happen. And when they get to the emergency department, that's not what happens, right? So parents are going to steel themselves up for the fight of saying, this is just the first step of getting children, my child, what they need. And then in order to do that, you actually have to say to the system that we distressed in the first place, that you're really not doing what is in the best interest of my child. And you're going to give me this resource of family response because we haven't changed that first step. But your other point was for families who hadn't gotten to that place, that family response was really the answer, right? Because they didn't have to get to that place of this saying, I'm going to fight this system. I'm going to really make sure that my child gets what they need. And now I'm convinced what they need is inpatient care, right? And so that's a real distinction in terms of what was interesting to me in watching as the work got done in Hennepin. That level of distrust on the systems piece was really at a pretty high level, but also I think the other thing that I think is helpful and for folks to hear from you around is the real challenge around Minnesota being a medical model driven world, right? Which I mean, it's really a medical model driven world. I work in a lot of states that are, but Minnesota's pretty up there. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other one I want to mention is sometimes families, as they're going to the ER, it's not because there's increased acuity of the behavior, it's the daily, and families are just feeling burnt out, feeling no help in their own community. And as they see no decrease of the whatever was happening, they feel like this might be the stop of all. We're
That's right.
asking families are coming in and asking, take my child, and I don't place him somewhere. And that's what it leads to, as we look things through a medical lens, is the professionals who are questioning the validity of even FRSs.
Yeah.
If they are already here at the hospital and they're already needing this, could you prevent? Or so you're going to come into the hospital having those boundaries set. So mobile response FRSs will come to the hospital and take their family. And if we make a referral to FRSs, are we liable for something? So it's because of these gatekeeping and using the medical model to. So the idea for us then is, as I mentioned, I didn't mention, this is more of an evolution and revolution. The evolution is we're doing something different. And the revolution is we need to somehow, in a professional way, push back against the idea of everything has to fit into a medical bucket.
Yeah.
Some of the things that kids do, and especially in these times, there is a need. There is something else that families, when given the option, especially immigrant and refugee. I know I worked in Columbus, Ohio for a nonprofit, and we would see kids coming in and out of residential treatments.
Mm-hmm.
And the outcomes were not positive at all. The longer you stayed in a residential, the worse the outcome. So families, as they're asking for this, it's because they're putting their hope and their dreams of this last option, because they were not getting the support. And then the system that was there did not really value their own input and ideas. And this is to shift that narrative and say, family defines the urgency. The family defines the need, and we're there to meet them and support them without using eligibility requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I'm going to guess that some of this feels very familiar to Hazelyn, in particular around that experience for our families, because I know that you've sat with a lot of families around the emergency department visit. So I wondered if you wanted to share anything. And then there's a comment in the chat I wanted to address too. So you're on.
Thank you, Liz. And Assad, wonderful presentation, very rich. I think families, like you said, Assad, when they come to us or get to that point, they really are just looking for relief in any form that it's available. And oftentimes they don't know or understand the service options or even the ramifications of some of the things that they may be asking for. So I think one of our opportunities here as a family organization is to really help families understand the service options and what each one means, and to, as importantly, to have a clear vision for what they are looking to have as an outcome, because that really drives a lot of the decision making. And so I think that having that system navigation piece that includes explaining the service options and helping families to really craft that vision of what they want to have as an outcome becomes really, those two things together become really important as we do this work. And understanding the roles of each of the entities, mobile response, the care management organization, the family support organization, and the whole system that surrounds us is really important.
Thank you, Hazelyn. That's totally true, right? It's like,
just as they say, I'm sorry, just as they say, it takes a village to raise a child. We also need a village of services, not just personnel, a village of services. And the services, the way they're designed, are not coordinated. So family, it's the onus on the family to navigate and know what you're eligible for and what you can get, rather than an easier access point. So as families come in, they have an easy way to transition from one service to another as need dictates. But that's not what's the reality on the ground.
Yeah.
Well, the other challenge with that, right, is that if families are just trying to get what they can get, right, because they're grabbing at straws, then it doesn't meet that other real challenge, which is what we know works, and that is getting the right service, the right support in place at the right time for the right duration. And that those components or those things within a system and a system's design that's organized in a way to say, is this the right thing, right? As an example, you might have a young person in which residential might be the right thing, right? And in that instance, if you can clear the barriers and get that young person to that residential quickly, then they're there shorter period of time, and that intervention is much more successful, right? Which gets back to this idea that talked about earlier around the sequencing and when and how resources go in, and when young people are ready for more formal interventions, right? And it's in the preparation and how do we get them ready. I think it's really important conversation around the role of both the service, right? The actual service of family response, and the thoughtfulness around saying that there are things we have to do to change this community, right? That not change the community, I'm sorry, to change our engagement with the community, right? Our engagement strategy, how it is that we are going to bring folks into these conversations, right? How are we going to engage in conversations with people who have a lot to teach us, right, around what works, is really why I wanted you to join us today, because it's such a really unique way of thinking about how to install a new intervention like, family response and stabilization, which started, in this conversation of an interruption point for the emergency department, and quickly moved to, we have to innovate and get into communities so there are trusted people who can help us, right, communicate.
Yeah, and that's why we wanted to contract this service to a community-based agency that has the community's perception of delivering the good service. The responders right now we have all reflect on the rich diversity of our community, the culturally specific providers, because what we heard is from the communities, I want somebody who understands what it means to be me.
That's right. That's right.
And you can argue with that.
That's right. Totally. So Assad, in the chat, there was a request for the protocols around the emergency departments and whether or not you're willing to share what you've learned so far. And I wanted to just preface that answer by saying that Hennepin County is unique in Minnesota. You're the only county, the only group of folks who are really trying this, and the state of Minnesota is looking at whether or not this is really a place in which we want to invest more resources. Because currently, Minnesota has an adult model of crisis intervention, even for children and families, that require, in a sense, dangerousness to self or others, right? And so I wanted to preface that so that folks know that protocols are going to be what Hennepin has learned within this pilot of this first year of the work, right?
Yeah, yeah. As Liz mentioned, and that was the idea is families have to wait until they feeling that this will cross that threshold. That if I make this call, someone would come to me now at this point. And families sometimes feel disappointed as they make a call and are expressing an urgency about a behavior, but that doesn't really fit into the medical model of what it means to be a mental health crisis, right? So FRS, as we brought this service, is to say, these are not competing services. These are complementing services. So as one is focused toward a specific demographics, adults, this one would support more on the children. And the family is at the heart of this because they determine when they need this service and we would respond to. And the question related to the protocol, I would love to get back and ask if I'm able to it's an institution. So with an institution, I have to clear with some of the communication individuals. But I would love if I do get the clearance to give that to Liz, and hopefully Liz can share into the.
Yeah. So if you share it with us, we'll share it with everybody who's joined us today. For sure.
Absolutely.
Okay. So thank you for that question and that comment. I also wanted to just get back to some of the other conversation around what other things do you think that Hennepin's going to need to work on in order to connect some of the dots?
I think sustaining the relationship, because we're seeing a positive response with communities that are really excited and are saying, when we go into community spaces, it's not, oftentimes we hear, I know someone in my own family that could benefit from this service. It's not someone would need down the road, is I already know somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So keeping that trust, the reason why, and building the momentum to say, this is a service that's supported by the county, but we don't need to be the big H leading this effort. Mm-hmm. We want to cultivate that partnership with the contracted agencies and continue to build as we see a need from other demographics. We know we have a large Asian American community, we have a Native American community. As we expand those services, can we truly build a community of practice? Mm-hmm. And once we do that, then we are able to say we have delegated the task of making those connections, and we don't have to be edge can stand on the side and allow that relationship to flourish. It's also also defining what the service and who is, because what is the service for? The revolution also is providers that see a service and go, oh yeah, I can call this for so-and-so. Mm-hmm. This is not a provider initiative that they determine and decide, I need to call on behalf of a family. This is to give the information to a family, mm-hmm. to support the family, sure. And identify their specific need. And if it meets this, to share the information. So also making sure that the service definition stays true to the intention.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so, I mean, I think the other really interesting work that Hennepin has done is to say, this is a starting place for us in this conversation. We recognize some of the challenges that we have. What's interesting from my perspective is that I see what Hennepin has done and continues to do as some of the same work and same lessons that we learned on the ground in New Jersey early on, right? That New Jersey had said, we're going to do these services, right? We're going to put the service array in and then sort of had to take a step back and say, wait a minute, this navigation issue is really important. Although I will say, I think we got there earlier because we had families who were driving the transformation, right? We had a group of parents who were driving the transformation. And so at least that's my experience. I'm wondering if Hazelden had that same sort of moment where you go, yeah, this is like, we're familiar with this.
Yeah, I certainly believe that a lot of the transformation that took place in New Jersey was because of the strength of family voice in system change. And as I was thinking about it earlier, I began to outline many of the places where both at the state level and at the local level, families had input. So going back more than a decade, families were around the table talking about what will it look like when we bring together different populations of children and families. For example, the DD community. We worked for months, and that was very much a family-driven process, mm-hmm. with the authentic voices of people with lived experiences around the table, stakeholder groups being convened, and conversations, courageous conversations, yes. about what needed to happen and what needed to be different and how we could do this work together. And fast forward more than a decade later, we have a system that has improved as a result of families continually being involved in the monitoring, evaluation, and feedback of what's working and what's not. So
I think that's very true. And as somebody who sat around the table around those policy decisions around resources and where they were going to go, who had to implement the plan that was developed by the parents of the children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. All of those things are really important. I think that, in this work, the lessons learned from today, at least some of my takeaways from both of you and your such amazing work, is that it's really important to talk to the people who are going to use the services, and that navigation is not insignificant, right? It's not like, oh, we're just going to do navigation. It is like that's where we start this conversation, right? We start with making sure that families who are feeling the worry about their child get somebody who can say, this is the direction to move in, right? These are your options. And you make decisions about which one of those options you want to try, right? That the feedback loop, the constant feedback loop of, yes, that's what we meant. Yes, this is working. Yes, is really powerful in terms of that work. And that if we're going to truly change and really customize crisis services for children in a way that is meaningful, that the true engagement of the young people, the families, and the communities, right, the places in which the healing takes place, have got to be part of the plan, right, from the start. That we don't build them in the back end. We start the planning from there, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and it leads to that Desmond Tutu quote, where at some point we have to stop pulling bodies from the river and go upstream and see why families are falling in. And the reason why they fall in is a multitude of reasons. So if we're waiting for them to end up in the same direction, or we're catching them as they are taken by downstream, then we're just setting ourselves up to fail. And how we could go upstream is building those meaningful relationship, bi-directional communication, where we're not dictating how people should live, but we're learning. And oftentimes people say underserved communities is undervalued communities, because if you're taking the value, you're going to embed that into your service and into system building.
That's exactly right. Listen, I want to thank both of you for joining us today. I mean, this has been a really wonderful, robust conversation about how, this community component of mobile response and stabilization is not a side effect. It's one of the drivers for systems reform and transformation. So I want to thank you both for joining us today. I know that we're getting that to the end. So I'm just going to say it was really, really helpful, and I'm grateful for your time and your energy. And to everybody who joined us today, thank you for joining us. Next month, we're going to be looking at workforce development, which is really also an important conversation. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you all.
Thank you for joining this month's Mobile Response and Stabilization Services Learning Community session. Please take a few moments to complete the evaluation for this session using the following link being posted in the chat. We will be providing a certificate of attendance after completion of each session being offered throughout the entire series. So make sure that you are registered with the same name logged into each session so that we can confirm your attendance and the total time you were a part of this session. Please allow up to 10 business days for your certificate of attendance to become available in Ideas at the Institute. Any presentations, resources, and recordings will be made available to you within Ideas at the Institute. Once you are registered for the learning community, you will have access to all of the upcoming and previously recorded sessions. We hope you join us again for next month's session. You can access the Zoom link for each session and download a calendar appointment for that session by logging into Ideas at the Institute. Access the MRSS Learning Community curriculum and click the View button for that upcoming session. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Learning Community session.